through the Asia-Africa summit. And so the Chinese have been investing a great deal of time in persuading Indonesian leaders of the merits of their various projects that they're putting forward. To my mind, this is one of the questions one has to ask about Jokowi. We'd previously thought that he was very development-minded and could be quite technocratic and rational. But in the case of the fast train project between Jakarta and Bandung that he was referring to, this is a classic case in point. The Japanese got the contract to build the subway, the MRT, in Jakarta, or they're the main contractor. And there's a sense in Indonesia that these deals have to be shared around. But if you look at Japan's record in building high-speed railways and China's record, you would say there's really no argument. The Japanese have got a superb record of reliable investment in Indonesia, high engineering standards. Everything they build works well. The Chinese have got a very checkered history in Indonesia. The power stations they built often never get more than 30 or 40% of their design capacity and the like, because there are all sorts of problems with them. So by rights, if the government was doing this on the basis of merit, that project should have gone to the Japanese. And I think we've seen anger on the part of the Japanese government, which is unprecedented towards Indonesia, and indeed towards any other country, I think, for a long, long time, because they felt as if their claim was so much stronger than the Chinese. So clearly, Jokowi felt as if on this matter, some special treatment towards, some privileged treatment towards the Chinese would be a good thing. I think it's going to turn out to be a bad thing for Indonesia, I must say.
I agree that this railway incident has hurt reputation of Indonesian international forum, and so I'm hoping that Jokowi can, learn from it, and especially now that there is this new thing, TPP, which China is not part of, but also on the other hand, there is RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which China is a part of. So Indonesia should really be careful in dealing with this, and because at the same time, Indonesia is also preparing itself for the AEC, ASEAN Economic Community. So all these things has to be in the eye of Jokowi also.
Perhaps I should have mentioned that before. I mean, Luhut Panjaitan, this very important minister, and Jokowi himself have not ruled out. In fact, they've made almost teasing comments about the possibility of Indonesia joining the TPP. Do you think that's a realistic scenario?
It is probably, but in terms of time, Indonesia has been investing on AEC and RCEP, so I think in terms of priority, they should really focus on these two former negotiations, which is actually, both of them are ending this the negotiation this year, right? So TPP is next in the agenda because Indonesia is not part of the TPP, but for ASEAN and RCEP, of course, Indonesia is there, and RCEP is basically ASEAN plus 6, right? So China, Korea, India, Australia, also New Zealand are part of this, and I think Indonesia should pay attention more towards what is going on in the region. But at the same time, of course, TPP is also important because it covers a lot of economy in the world, and the idea of both TPP and RCEP actually to streamline all these conflicting rules as a result of FTS, bilateral FTS, which is making some kind of spaghetti ball effect. So it's a good thing if Indonesia can maybe lead in ASEAN for these two initiatives, ASEAN and RCEP.
I think it's fair to say that in Jokowi we see a president that is perhaps far less concerned with his own image overseas, and perhaps even with Indonesia's image overseas, compared to President Yudhoyono. I mean, Australians will be familiar with the execution of 2 of our nationals in February this year, the current haze crisis that's engulfing Southeast Asia, and of course, like you said, some of these issues to do with investment climate and perceived openness to foreign investment. How much do you think of this so-called resurgence in nationalism that we're hearing about, particularly in the foreign media, can be sheeted home to Jokowi, his own example, or perhaps a lack of leadership on his part? Or how much of this was just going to happen anyway?
I think that's an interesting question, because if we look at some of the sort of policy manifestations of this kind of increased assertiveness in the nationalist tone of politics in Indonesia, some of the more nationalist policies and nationalist rhetoric that we observe in the mineral mining sector were very much part of SBY's administration and his last term. So to an extent, in my own research, I've been seeing this trend toward more assertive nationalism for some time. But I think that we can see the presidential elections as almost a turning point in the kind of mainstreaming of this more aggressive nationalism. And we can point partly to the kind of campaign that Prabowo launched. It was very aggressive, and it kind of painted this picture of Indonesia as a country that was regularly exploited and shamed by its neighbours and by foreign investors. And I think that perhaps many political elites saw that as resonating with the Indonesian publics. And perhaps that could explain to an extent why Jokowi has picked up on that and used that in ways that we hadn't expected, and why particular ministers have picked up on that and used that in ways that we wouldn't have expected. But I don't know, perhaps Greg wants to comment, or Archie.
Yeah, I think it's true about Jokowi. I think the world outside Indonesia for Jokowi is of interest to him insofar as Indonesia can learn from other countries and also make money out of them by exporting Indonesian products, or bringing in the kind of investment that allows him to achieve these very ambitious goals that he's set for his infrastructure program, also to a lesser extent for health and education. And you mentioned the executions, Liam. I think that's a very good example where one of the things that was said to him by a senior advisor was, if the economy was growing at 7%, President, well then perhaps it wouldn't matter if you're executing all these people from foreign countries. But when the economy is actually doing poorly and is growing below, 5%, well then actually you cannot afford to be alienating all these foreign countries. And that was packaged in a way that that person thought Jokowi would understand. The moment it hit Indonesia's ability to get what it wanted from the world outside, well then that became a concern to him. And I think he's actually an extraordinarily insular president in that regard, with a very instrumental view of how he sees foreign relations anyway, and the narrowest agenda that we've seen of any president, I think, in Indonesian history. And so we also see the markedly different messages he has for an international audience, where he's trying to get investment and promote exports, and the very nationalistic rhetoric he has when he's dealing with Indonesian audiences. We from outside see a clear contradiction in this. It's another one of the mysteries for Jokowi, whether that is a contradiction in his own mind or all of these things can be rationalised. But I think it's going to be a problem for him, because more and more people will see him as being inconsistent.
Now, of course, one of the things that was a real stain on the legacy of the Yudhoyono government was the deterioration in the rights and security of religious minorities in Indonesia. Now, Jokowi came to office known for being not particularly orthodox Muslim, and his party that nominated him sees itself as the vanguard sort of Indonesian pluralism. So has that made a difference, or are we still seeing that continued decline in religious pluralism in Indonesia?
If we look at, it's a mixed picture. If we look at the statistics from the NGOs that collect data on religious conflict, religious violence and harassment, the figures are better for the last year or so than what they've been through the final years of the SBY period. However, Jokowi himself can take, I think, very little credit for that. He has a religious affairs minister, Lukman Hakim Saifuddin, who has been the most progressive of any religious affairs minister going back probably at least 12 years. And he's not unalloyed in his promotion of religious tolerance. He also picks his battles and at times makes strategic retreats. But overall, I think most people accept that he is trying to make Indonesia a more religiously tolerant place. In the case of Jokowi, there are almost no statements on the public record about religious tolerance. We do have responses to particular incidents of violence, such as the Tolikara case in Papua, and in fact state officials responded very well to that, and they were able to prevent that from spreading much more widely. We've had a somewhat similar response to the church burning in Aceh. But overall, the disappointment with Jokowi is that he hasn't set a tone of tolerance himself. And we can look at this not just in religious field, but more broadly in political sphere. So in the last few weeks, we've had controversies over such things as the ability of the Shiite community in Indonesia to celebrate the Ashura festival, one of the main festivals on the religious calendar of Shia Muslims. There's been no statement from the government about that, which is very disappointing. Also, we see the closing down of the public discourse, the public discussion about the mass killings in 1965. And both of these things are surprising because Jokowi's main political affiliation is with Megawati's PDIP, the Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle. And that party has within its parliamentary representation a prominent Shia intellectual, and it also has several people who come from former communist families of victims of these killings. And so PDIP of all parties has a track record of defending not only secular rights but also an open historical judgment of these critical events in Indonesian history. What we see under Jokowi is a narrowing, a closing down of a lot of that debate, and that for me was entirely unexpected, and that shows that Jokowi to some extent is captive of very conservative elements in the military, and he's not giving any pushback to these very regressive moves that those people are seeking to undertake.
On the other side of the ledger, though, to an extent, Jokowi has a better sort of relationship or rapport with progressive elements of Indonesian civil society and the Indonesian political system. His new chief of staff is one of the founders of a key anti-corruption NGO. He has the ability to communicate with sort of liberals in civil society and so on. Is there any kind of pattern to who he listens to and who he ignores? Because it seems like he gets advice from all corners, but like you said, listens to the conservatives. Does that reflect just a fundamental conservative ideological outlook on his part?
Well, I'll just quickly answer a little bit of that. My view is that one thing, he's turning out to be far more intellectually narrow president than what I had previously imagined. In fact, he cares about a relatively small range of things. And some of the rhetoric during the presidential election campaign, indeed as Jakarta governor, in fact, I now suspect was scripted for him, and he himself had very little input to that. So these issues of religious tolerance, of human rights, of continuing political reform, I think he regards those as expendable. They are second or third order matters. What most matters for him is development, is economic growth, particularly dealing with the poorer people of Indonesia, and that's all very virtuous, so I'm not criticising that. But I wish that he had a broader vision of what his presidency could be, and that's what he lacks. So he does have these progressive people around him, but you rarely hear him investing in those progressive views in public, and I don't really think he feels at all confident in doing so.
Indeed, I mean, it seems like if you can actually frame a reactionary political agenda in the kind of language of development and economics that appeals to him, you can get him to do some remarkable things. For instance, this recent decree that he signed that protects local officials from prosecution for corruption. Has he bought into this idea that actually the anti-corruption effort is getting in the way of so-called development?
Yes. But and this is again one of the most surprising, I think, developments over the past year, is that Jokowi, the president, who was very much supported by anti-corruption activists, reform activists, and so we all expected him, I guess, to implement and to pursue those sorts of reforms. And what was surprising is how quickly he abandoned the anti-corruption drive. And there are many reasons, I think, why he did that. But it demonstrates, I think, a fickleness in the way he approaches policy and the way he approaches people. And what's surprising is that it's under Jokowi's watch, not under a previous president, that we've seen the attack on anti-corruption, on the Corruption Eradication Commission. He enabled the criminalisation of their directors. He's enabling the Parliament to attack the law on anti-corruption in the Parliament, and he's also, as you said, Liam, he's now kind of singing the song of the old elites in terms of anti-corruption being a hindrance to efficiency and to development, and that these anti-corruption activists get in the way of the business of government. And I think that's really dangerous, in fact.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think that also applies to economic front. I mean, we have said about contradiction, and it's, at the end of the day, it's all a matter of who has Jokowi's ears, right? So we see very contradictory signals for if he talks about agriculture, for example, and then investment, because different ministers have different views and even contradictory at times. So it's unfortunate that it all matters of who get his ears, because he himself seems to be lacking the narratives.
You mentioned that someone who has his ear, and that brings up another little detail of his presidency. He's not known for being a reader, is he?
He doesn't seem to like it.
No. Another one of these actors who has sort of cloaked their own agenda in the language of national development is the military. Now, there's been quite a bit of speculation about how serious the military's efforts to sort of sneak its way back into areas of civilian governance have been under the Jokowi presidency. Do you think that it's too early to be alarmed, or is something really significant going on here?
It looks like it could be developing a kind of momentum that would make one concerned, because we have a consistent pattern of senior military and defence officials, including the Defence Minister, coming out and making statements that, and indeed taking the initial steps to put in place programs that would greatly expand the role of the military within society. And much when the so-called reformasi process began in 1998, after Suharto was forced from office, one of the key targets of the reformers was the military. They wanted the military as much as possible back in the barracks. And what we've seen under Jokowi, to an extent that again was one of the really surprising things about his presidency, is how he either didn't care or indeed was happy to go along with the military coming back out of the barracks and being involved in village development, distributing food, building bridges and roads, engaging in ideological campaigns on campuses, taking a much bigger role in counter-terrorism, even providing staff for prisons. So there are a whole range of things that have been proposed, and some new, quite extensive moves that are now underway, such as having in effect a civilian defence force that might be as many as 100 million people, and everyone under the age of 50 is obliged to be involved. There's been not that broader range of opposition to that at the moment, but we just see in the next year, when people consider the cost of this, when ordinary citizens start working out how disruptive this might be, and indeed whether it's at all necessary under current circumstances in which Indonesia really doesn't face a legitimate threat anywhere in the region, whether this is all worthwhile, or is this a self-interested military pushing these programs. I'm hoping that it's the latter, that people begin to push back against this, and that the efforts of the current TNI, the current Armed Forces head, and the current Defence Minister will end up facing serious resistance. But at the moment, you'd have to say they have wind in their sails.
Now, just one last question. I know it seems a bit silly to speculate about the 2019 election so far out, but let's do it anyway. There have been several polls that have come out in the last week or so in conjunction with the 1-year anniversary of Jokowi's inauguration. They've actually started measuring the electability of candidates for the election in 4 years' time. Prabowo Subianto looks like he's still very much a contender. Where is Prabowo now? What's he doing? And what is his agenda for the next 4 years?
Ooh. I would just say he might try again and he will fail again.
You're confident that Jokowi will